The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 8, Side 2. Folk song flourished at all times, and learned music periodically rejuvenated itself at that fount. Popular melodies were adapted for complex madrigals, for hymns, even for passages in music for the Mass. In Florence, says Cellini, people were wont to meet on the public streets of a summer night to sing and dance. Street singers, cantori di piazza, strummed their sad or merry notes on handsome lutes. People gathered to sing laudes, hymns of praise to the Virgin before her street or roadside shrines. And in Venice, mating songs rose to the moon from 100 gondolas, or throaty lovers hopefully serenaded hesitant lasses in the mystic shadows of labyrinthine canals. Almost every Italian could sing, and nearly as many could sing in simple vertical harmony. Hundreds of these popular part songs have come down to us under the picturesque name of frutole, little fruits. Usually short, usually amorous, arranged for a dominant soprano supported by tenor, alto, and bass. Whereas in previous centuries the tenor voice had held the melody and so derived its name, now in the 15th the air was carried by the soprano, so called because its music was written above the rest. This part did not need a female voice. As often as not it was sung by a boy, or by the falsetto of an adult male. Castrati did not appear in the papal choir till 1562. Among the educated classes, considerable knowledge of music was required. Castiglione demands of his courtier or gentleman some amateur proficiency in music, which not only doth make sweet the minds of men, but also many times doth wild beasts tame. Every person of culture was expected to read simple music at sight, accompany himself on some instrument, and take part in an impromptu musicale. Sometimes people joined in a ballata that involved a union of singing, dancing, and instrumental music. Universities after 1400 offered courses and degrees in music. There were hundreds of music academies. Vittorino da Feltre founded a school of music at Mantua about 1425. Our conservatories of music are called so because in Naples many orphanages, or conservatori, were used as music schools. Music was further spread by the adaptation of printing to musical notation. About 1476, Ulrich Hahn printed at Rome a complete missal with movable type for notes and lines. And in 1501, Ottaviano de Petrucci began at Venice the commercial printing of motets and frutole. At the courts, music was more prominent than any other art except those of personal adornment. Usually the ruler chose a favorite church, whose choir became the object of his care. He paid goodly sums to attract to it the finest available voices and instrumentalists from Italy, France, and Burgundy. He trained new singers from their childhood, as Federigo did at Urbino. And he expected the members of the choir to perform also for his state ceremonies and court festivals. Guillaume Dufay of Burgundy directed music at the court of the Malatestas in Rimini and Pesaro, and at the papal chapel in Rome for a quarter of a century, from 1419 to 1444. Galeazzo Maria Sforza, about 1460, organized 2 chapel choirs, and brought to them from France Josquin des Prés, then the most famous composer in Western Europe. When Lodovico Sforza welcomed Leonardo to Milan, it was as a musician, and it is to be noted that Leonardo was accompanied in going from Florence to Milan by Atalante Migliorotti, a celebrated musician and maker of musical instruments. A still more famous maker of lyres, lutes, organs, and clavichords was Lorenzo Gusnasco of Pavia, who made Milan one of his homes. The court of Lodovico was flush with singers: Narciso, Testagrossa, Cordier of Flanders, and Cristoforo Romano, chastely loved by Beatrice. Pedro Maria of Spain conducted concerts in the palace and for the public, and Francino Gaffuri founded and taught in a famous private music school in Milan. Isabella d'Este was devoted to music, made it the chief theme of decoration in her inner sanctum, and herself played several instruments. When she ordered a clavichord from Lorenzo Gusnasco, she specified that the keyboard should respond to a light touch, for our hands are so delicate that we cannot play well if the keys are too stiff. At her court lived the leading lutenist of his day, Marchetto Cara and Bartolomeo Tromboncino, who composed such alluring madrigals that When he killed his unfaithful wife, no punishment was meted out to him, and the matter was passed over as a discord soon to be resolved. Finally, the cathedrals and the churches, the monasteries and the nunneries resounded with music. In Venice, Bologna, Naples, Milan, the nuns sang vespers so movingly that crowds flocked to hear them. Sixtus IV organized the famous Sistine Chapel choir. Julius II added in St. Peter's a Capella Julia, or Julian Chapel choir, which trained singers for the Sistine choir. This was the summit of the Latin world's musical art in the Renaissance. To it came the greatest singers from all Roman Catholic countries. Plain chant was still the letter of canon law in church music, but here and there the Ars Nova of France, a form of complex counterpoint, made its way into the Roman choirs and prepared for Palestrina and Victoria. Once it had been held undignified to have any other musical instrument than the organ accompany a church choir, but in the 16th century a variety of instruments were brought in to give church music some of the grace and adornment of secular performances. At St. Mark's in Venice, the Flemish master, Adrian Villart of Bruges, presided over the choirs for 35 years and trained them to such performances as made Rome envious. At Florence, Antonio Squarcialupi organized a school of harmony, of which Lorenzo was a member. For a generation, Antonio reigned over the cathedral choir, and the great Duomo rang with music that stilled all philosophic doubt. Leon Battista Alberti was a doubter, but when the choir sang, he believed. All other modes of singing weary with repetition. Only religious music never palls. I know not how others are affected, but for myself, those hymns and psalms of the Church produce on me the very effect for which they were designed, soothing all disturbance of the soul and inspiring a certain ineffable languor, full of reverence toward God. What heart of man is so rude as not to be softened when he hears the rhythmic rise and fall of those voices, complete and true, in cadences so sweet and flexible? I assure you that I never listened to the Greek words Kyrie eleison, that call on God for aid against our human wretchedness, without weeping. Then, too, I ponder what power music brings with it to soften us and soothe. Despite all this popularity, music was the one art in which Italy lagged behind France during most of the Renaissance. Shorn of papal revenues by the flight of the popes to Avignon, and with the courts of the despots still culturally immature in the 14th century, Italy lacked then the means and the spirit for the higher grades of music. She produced lovely madrigals, a word of uncertain derivation, but these songs, modeled on those of the Provençal troubadours, were set to a musical frame of such strictly regulated polyphony that the form died of its own rigidity. The pride of Trecento music in Italy was Francesco Landini, organist of San Lorenzo in Florence. Though blind from his childhood, he became one of the finest and most loved musicians of his time, honored as an organist, lutenist, composer, poet, and philosopher. But even he took his lead from France. His 200 secular compositions applied to Italian lyrics the Ars Nova that had captured France a generation before. The new art was doubly new. It accepted binary rhythms as well as the triple time previously required in the music of the Church. And it devised a more complex and flexible musical notation. Pope John XXII, who hurled his thunderbolts in all directions, aimed one at the Ars Nova as fanciful and degenerate, and his prohibition had some effect in discouraging musical development in Italy. However, John XXII could not live forever, though at times it seemed possible. After his death at the age of 90 in 1334, the new art triumphed in the learned music of France, and shortly thereafter in Italy. At Avignon, French and Flemish singers and composers constituted the papal choir. When the papacy returned to Rome, it brought with it a large number of French, Flemish, and Dutch composers and singers. And for a century, these alien musicians and their successors dominated the music of Italy. As late as Sixtus IV, all the voices in the papal choir were from beyond the Alps. And a like foreign supremacy ruled in the music of the courts in the 15th century. When Squarcialupi died, circa 1475, Lorenzo chose a Dutchman, Heinrich Isaac, to succeed him as organist in the cathedral at Florence. Heinrich wrote music for some of the Canti Carneschaleschi and for Politian's lyrics, and he taught the future Leo X to love, even to compose, French songs. For a time, the chansons of France were sung in Italy, as once Italy had recited the lays of the troubadours. This invasion of Italy by French musicians, preceding by a century its invasion by French armies, produced toward 1520 a revolution in Italian music. For these men from the north, and the Italians whom they trained, were steeped in the Ars Nova, and applied it in setting to music the lyric poetry of Italy. In Petrarch, Ariosto, Sanazzaro, and Bembo, later in Tasso and Guarini, they found delectable verses crying out for music. Indeed, had not poetry always intended itself to be at least a recitative, if not a song? Petrarch's Canzoniere had already lured musicians. Now every line of it was set to music, some stanzas a dozen times or more. Petrarch is the most completely musicked poet in world literature. Or there were little lyrics of unknown authorship but simple and viable sentiment that touched the chords of every heart and invited the strings of every instrument. For example, one from the other, borrowing leaves and flowers, I saw fair maidens beneath summer trees, weaving bright garlands with low love ditties. Mid that sweet sisterhood, the loveliest turned her soft eyes to me and whispered, "Take." Love-lost I stood, and not a word I spake. My heart she read, and her fair garland gave. Therefore I am her servant to the grave. To such verses the composers applied the full and complex music of the motet. Polyphony, in which all four parts, sung by 4 or 8 voices, were of equal value, instead of 3 parts subserving one. And all the complex subtlety of counterpoint and fugue wove the 4 independent rivulets of sound into a stream of harmony. So rose the Italian madrigal of the 16th century, one of the fairest flowers of Italian art. Whereas in Dante's time music had been a handmaid to poetry, now it became a full-fledged partner, not obscuring the words, not slurring the sentiment, but uniting them with the music that made them doubly stir the soul, while delighting with its technical skill the educated mind. Almost all the great composers of 16th century Italy, even Palestrina, turned their art now and then to the madrigal. Philippe Verdelot, a Frenchman living in Italy, and Costanza Festa, an Italian, contest the honor of having first developed the new form between 1520 and 1530. Soon after them came the Archidelt, a Fleming in Rome, mentioned by Rabelais. In Venice, Adrian Villart relaxed from his duties as choirmaster at San Marco to compose the finest madrigals of his time. Usually the madrigal was sung without instrumental accompaniment. Musical instruments were innumerable, but only the organ dared compete with the human voice. Instrumental music slowly developed in the early 16th century out of music forms originally intended for dances or choruses. So the pavan, the saltarello, and the saraband graduated from dance accompaniments to instrumental pieces, alone or in suite. And the music for a madrigal, played without song, became the instrumental canzone, the distant progenitor of the sonata, and therefore of the symphony. The organ was already in the 14th century almost as highly developed as today. The pedal board appeared in Germany and the Low Countries in that age, and was soon adopted in France and Spain. Italy delayed acceptance of it till the 16th century. By that time, most large organs had 2 or 3 keyboards, with a variety of stops and couplers. Great church organs were themselves works of art, designed, carved, and painted by masters. The same love of form went into the making of other musical instruments. The lute, the favorite instrument of the home, was built of wood and ivory, shaped like a pear, pierced with sound holes in a graceful pattern, with a fingerboard divided by frets of silver or brass, and ending in a peg box turned at a right angle to the neck. A pretty woman plucking the strings of a lute held in her lap made a picture that went to the head of many a sensitive Italian. Harps, citherns, psalters, dulcimers, and guitars were also favorites with musical fingers. For those who preferred fiddling to plucking, there were viols of diverse sizes, including the tenor viola da braccio, held on the arm, and the bass viola da gamba, resting against the leg. The latter became the later violoncello, and the viol about 1540 became the violin. Wind instruments were less popular than the stringed. The Renaissance had the same objection that Alcibiades had raised to making music by puffing out the cheeks. Nevertheless, there were flutes and fifes, or pipes, bagpipes, trumpets, horns, flageolets, and the shawm, or oboe. Percussion instruments, drums, tabors, cymbals, tambourines, castanets added their fury to the ensemble. All Renaissance musical instruments were of Oriental origin, except for the keyboard that was added to other instruments besides the organ to indirectly strike or pluck the strings. The oldest of these keyboard instruments was the clavichord, clavis meaning key, which appeared in the 12th century and had a sentimental resurrection in the days of Bach. Here the strings were struck with little brass tangents operated by the keys. In the 16th century it was displaced by the clavicembalo, or harpsichord, whose strings were plucked by points of quill or leather attached to wooden jacks that rose when the keys were depressed. The virginal was an English, the spinet an Italian, variant of the harpsichord. All these instruments were as yet subordinate to the voice, and the great virtuosos of the Renaissance were singers. But at the baptism of Alfonso of Ferrara in 1476, we hear of a feast in the Schifanoia Palace, at which a concert was given by 100 trumpeters, pipers, and tambourine players. In the 16th century, the Signory of Florence employed a regular band of musicians, of which Cellini was one. Performances by several instruments in concert were given in this period, but they were still for the aristocratic few. On the other hand, solo instrumental performances were almost fanatically popular. Men went to church not always to pray, but to hear a great organist like Squarcialupi or Orcagna. When Pietro Bono played the lute at the court of Borso in Ferrara, the souls of the listeners, we are told, flew out of this world into another. The great executants were the happy favorites of a day, who asked no fame of posterity, but received all their renown before their deaths. Musical theory lagged a generation behind practice. Performers innovated, professors denounced, then debated, then approved. Meanwhile, the principles of polyphony, counterpoint, and fugue were formulated for easier instruction and transmission. The great musical feature of the Renaissance was not theory, nor even technical advances. It was the increasing secularization of music. In the 16th century, it was no longer religious music that made the advances and experiments. It was the music of the madrigal and the courts. Side by side with philosophy and literature, and reflecting the pagan aspect of Renaissance art and the relaxation of morals, the music of 16th century Italy escaped from ecclesiastical control and sought inspiration in the poetry of love. The old conflict between religion and sex was resolved for a time in the triumph of Eros. The reign of the Virgin ended, the ascendancy of woman began, but under either rule, music was the handmaid of the queen. 11. Perspective. Were the morals of Renaissance Italy really worse than those of other lands or times? It is difficult to make comparisons, since all evidence is a selection. The age of Alcibiades in Athens displayed much of the immorality of the Renaissance in sexual relations and political chicanery. It, too, practiced abortion on a large scale and cultivated erudite courtesans. It, too, liberated simultaneously the intellect and the instincts. And, anticipating Machiavelli, sophists like Thrasybulus in Plato's Republic attacked morality as weakness. Perhaps, for in these matters we are limited to vague impressions, there was less private violence in classic Greece than in Renaissance Italy, and a bit less of corruption in religion and politics. During an entire century of Roman history, from Caesar to Nero, we find greater corruption in government and a worse breakdown of marriage than in the Renaissance. But even in that epoch there remained many stoic virtues in the Roman character. Caesar, with all his ambivalent capacity in bribery and love, was still the greatest general in a nation of generals. The individualism of the Renaissance was another side of its intellectual vivacity, but compares unfavorably, in morals and politics, with the communal spirit of the Middle Ages. Political deceit, treachery, and crime were probably as rife in France, Germany, and England in the 14th and 15th centuries as in Italy, but those countries had the wisdom not to produce a Machiavelli to expound and expose the principles of their statecraft. Manners, not morals, were coarser north of the Alps than below them, except for a small class in France, exemplified by the Chevalier Bayard and Gaston de Foix, which still retained the better side of chivalry. Given equal opportunity, the French were as adept at adultery as the Italians. Observe how readily they adopted syphilis. Note the sexual melee in the Fabliaux. Count the 24 mistresses of Duke Philip of Burgundy, and the Agnès Sorels and Diane de Poitiers of the French kings. Read Brantôme. Germany and England in the 14th and 15th centuries were too poor to rival Italy in immorality. Travelers from these countries were therefore astounded by the laxity of Italian life. Luther, visiting Italy in 1511, concluded that if there is a hell, then Rome is built upon it, and this I have heard in Rome itself. Everyone knows the shock judgment of Roger Ascham, the English scholar who visited Italy about 1550. I was once in Italy myself, but I thank God my abode there was but 9 days. And yet I saw in that little time in one city more liberty to sin than ever I heard tell in our noble city of London in 9 years. I saw it was there as free to sin, not only without all punishment, but also without any man's marking, as it is free in the city of London to choose without all blame whether a man lust to wear shoe or pantacle. And he quotes as an established proverb the saying, Inglese Italianato e un diavolo incarnato. An Englishman Italianate is a devil incarnate. We know the corruption of Italy better than that of Transalpine Europe because we know more about Italy, and because the Italian laity made little effort to conceal its immorality, and sometimes wrote books defending it. However, Machiavelli, who wrote such a book, reckoned Italy as more corrupt than all other countries. Next come the French and the Spaniards. He admired the Germans and the Swiss as still possessing many of the virile virtues of ancient Rome. We may diffidently conclude that Italy was more immoral because she was richer, weaker in government and the reign of law, and further advanced in that intellectual development which usually makes for a moral release. The Italians made some laudable efforts to check license. The vainest of these efforts were the sumptuary regulations that in nearly every state forbade extravagance or immodesty of dress. The vanity of men and women overrode with sly persistence the occasional assiduity of the law. The popes inveighed against immorality, but were in some cases swept along with the stream. Their attempts at reforming abuses in the church were nullified by the inertia or vested interests of the clergy. They themselves were rarely as wicked as passionate history once painted them, but they were more concerned to re-establish the political power of the papacy than to restore the moral integrity of the church. In our corrupt times, said Guicciardini, the goodness of a pontiff is commended when it does not surpass the wickedness of other men. Valiant attempts at reform were made by the great preachers of the time, men like St. Bernardino of Siena, Roberto da Lecce, San Giovanni da Capistrano, and Savonarola. Their sermons and their audiences were part of the color and character of the age. They denounced vice with a vivid detail that contributed to their popularity. They persuaded feudists to forswear revenge and live in peace. They induced governments to release insolvent debtors and let exiles return home. They brought hardened sinners back to long-neglected sacraments. Even these powerful preachers failed. The instincts, formed through 100,000 years of hunting and savagery, had re-emerged through the cracked shell of a morality that had lost the support of religious belief, of respected authority, and established law. The great church that had once ruled kings could no longer govern or cleanse itself. The destruction of political liberty in state after state had dulled the civic sense that had enfranchised and ennobled the medieval communes. Where there had been citizens, there were now only individuals. Excluded from government and flush with wealth, men turned to the pursuit of pleasure, and foreign invasion surprised them in siren arms. The city-states had for 2 centuries directed their forces, their subtlety, and their treachery against one another. It was now impossible for them to unite against a common foe. Preachers like Savonarola, rebuffed in all pleas for reform, called down the judgment of heaven upon Italy and predicted the destruction of Rome and the breakup of the Church. France, Spain, and Germany, weary of sending tribute to finance the wars of the Papal States and the luxuries of Italian life, looked with amazement and envy at a peninsula so shorn of will and power, so inviting in beauty and wealth. The birds of prey gathered to feast on Italy. Chapter 21. The Political Collapse, 1494 to 1534. 1. France discovers Italy, 1494 to 1495. Recall the situation of Italy in 1494. The city-states had grown through the rise of a middle class, enriched by the development and management of commerce and industry. They had lost their communal freedom through the inability of semi-democratic governments to maintain order amid the feuds of families and the conflicts of classes. Their economy remained local in structure, even while their fleets and products reached out to distant ports. They competed with one another more bitterly than with foreign states. They offered no concerted resistance to the expansion of French, German, and Spanish commerce into regions once dominated by Italy. Though Italy gave birth to the man who rediscovered America, it was Spain that financed him. Trade followed in his wake, gold accompanied his return. The Atlantic nations flourished, and the Mediterranean ceased to be the favored home of the white man's economic life. Portugal was sending ships around Africa to India and China, avoiding Moslem hindrances in the Near and Middle East. Even the Germans were shipping through the mouths of the Rhine rather than over the Alps to Italy. Countries that had for a century bought Italian woolen products were now making their own. Nations that had paid interest to Italian bankers were nursing their own financiers. Tithes, annats, Peter's pence, indulgence payments, and pilgrims' coins were now the chief economic contribution of Transalpine Europe to Italy, and soon a third of Europe would divert that flow. In this generation, when the stored-up wealth of Italy raised her cities to their supreme brilliance and art, Italy was economically doomed. She was also politically doomed. While she remained divided into warring economies and states, the development of a national economy was compelling and financing in other European societies the transition from feudal principalities to the monarchical state. France unified herself under Louis XI, reducing her barons to courtiers and her burghers to patriots. Spain unified herself by wedding Ferdinand of Aragon to Isabella of Castile and conquering Granada and cementing religious unity with blood. England unified herself under Henry VII, and though Germany was almost as fragmentary as Italy, it acknowledged one king and emperor and occasionally gave him money and soldiers to make war upon one or another of the Italian states. England, France, Spain, and Germany raised national armies out of their own people, and their aristocracies provided cavalry and leadership. The Italian cities had small forces of mercenaries inspired only by plunder, led by purchasable condottieri, and prejudiced against sustaining mortal injuries. It needed only one engagement to reveal to Europe the defenselessness of Italy. Half the courts of Europe now seethed with diplomatic intrigue as to which should seize the plum. France claimed the first right, and with many reasons. John Galeazzo Visconti had given his daughter Valentina in marriage in 1387 to Louis, 1st Duke of Orleans, and as the price of this comforting connection with the royal family, had recognized her right, and the right of her male issue, to succeed to the Duchy of Milan in case his own direct male line should fail, which it did when Filippo Maria Visconti died in 1447. His son-in-law, Francesco Sforza, then took Milan by right of his wife Bianca, Filippo Maria's daughter. But Charles, Duke of Orleans, claimed Milan as Valentina's son, denounced the Sforzas as usurpers, and proclaimed his resolve, when opportunity should offer, to appropriate the Italian principality. Moreover, said the French, Charles, Duke of Anjou, had received the kingdom of Naples from Pope Urban IV in 1266 as reward for defending the papacy against the Hohenstaufen kings. Joanna II had bequeathed the kingdom to René of Anjou in 1435. Alfonso I of Aragon had claimed it through her temporary adoption of him as her son, and had by force established the House of Aragon on the Neapolitan throne. René tried and failed to recapture the kingdom. His legal right to it passed at his death to Louis XI, King of France. And in 1482, Sixtus IV, at odds with Naples, invited Louis to come and conquer Naples, which, said the Pope, belongs to him. About this time, Venice, hard-pressed in war by a league of Italian states, called in desperation to Louis to attack either Naples or Milan, preferably both. Louis was busy unifying France, but his son Charles VIII inherited his claim to Naples, listened to the Angevin Neapolitan exiles at his court, noted that the crown of Naples was joined to that of Sicily, which carried with it the crown of Jerusalem. He conceived or was sold the grandiose idea of capturing Naples and Sicily, getting himself crowned King of Jerusalem, and then leading a crusade against the Turks. In 1489, Innocent VIII, quarreling with Naples, offered the kingdom to Charles if he would come and take it. Alexander VI, in 1494, forbade Charles on pain of excommunication to cross the Alps. But Alexander's enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who later as Julius II would war to drive the French from Italy, came to Charles at Lyons and urged him to invade Italy and depose Alexander. Savonarola added another invitation, hoping that Charles would depose Piero de' Medici in Florence and Alexander in Rome. And many Florentines accepted the friar's lead. Finally, Lodovico of Milan, fearing attack from Naples, offered Charles unimpeded passage through the territory of Milan whenever Charles should undertake a campaign against Naples. So, encouraged by half of Italy, Charles prepared to invade. To protect his flanks, he ceded Artois and Franche-Comté to Maximilian of Austria, and Roussillon and Cerdagne to Ferdinand of Spain, and paid a large sum to Henry VII for renouncing English claims on Brittany. In March 1494, he assembled his army at Lyons, 18,000 cavalry, 22,000 infantry. A fleet was sent to keep Genoa safe for France. On September 8th, it recaptured Rapallo from a Neapolitan force that had landed there, and the unrestrained bloodiness of this first encounter shocked an Italy accustomed to reasonable slaughter. In that month, Charles and his army crossed the Alps and paused at Asti. Lodovico of Milan and Ercole of Ferrara went there to meet him, and Lodovico lent him funds. Charles disrupted the schedule by getting smallpox. Recovering, he led his troops through the Milanese into Tuscany. The Florentine frontier fortresses at Sarzana and Pietrasanta might have resisted him, but Piero de' Medici came in person to surrender them, along with Pisa and Livorno. On November 7th, Charles and half his army paraded through Florence. The populace admired the unprecedented cavalcade, grumbled at petty thefts by the soldiery, but noted with relief that they refrained from rape. In December, Charles moved on toward Rome. We have already looked at the meeting of king and pope from Alexander's point of view. Charles behaved with moderation. He asked only a free passage through Latium for his army, the custody of the papal prisoner Gem, who might be used as a pretender and ally in a campaign against the Turks, and Caesar Borgia's company as a hostage. Alexander agreed. The army marched south. On January 25, 1495, Borgia soon escaped, and Alexander was free to reform the lines of his diplomacy. On February 22nd, Charles entered Naples in unresisted triumph, beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, borne by 4 Neapolitan nobles, and acclaimed by the cheers of the populace. He showed his appreciation by reducing taxes and pardoning those who had opposed his coming, and at the request of the barons who ruled the hinterland, he recognized the institution of slavery. Thinking himself secure, he relaxed to enjoy the climate and scenery. He wrote enthusiastically to the Duke of Bourbon, describing the gardens amid which he now lived, lacking only an eave to be paradise. He marveled at the architecture, sculpture, and painting in the city, and planned to take a selection of Italian artists with him to France. Meanwhile, he dispatched to France a shipment of stolen art. Naples so charmed him that he forgot about Jerusalem and his crusade. While he dallied in Naples and his army enjoyed the women of the streets and the stews and caught or spread the French disease, trouble was organizing behind him. The Neapolitan nobles, instead of being rewarded for helping depose their king, were in many cases deprived of their estates for the benefit of former Angevin possessors, or to pay Charles's debts to his servitors. All state offices were given to Frenchmen, and nothing could be obtained from them except by bribes offensively exceeding Neapolitan custom. The occupying army added insult to injury by their open contempt of the Italian people. In a few months, the French had worn out their welcome and earned a hatred that waited in fierce patience for a chance to expel the invaders. On March 31st, 1495, the resilient Alexander, the repentant Lodovico, the angry Ferdinand, the jealous Maximilian, the cautious Senate of Venice joined in a league for the united defense of Italy. King Charles, parading through Naples with a scepter in one hand and a ball, presumably the globe, in the other, took a month to realize that the new alliance was raising an army against him. On May 21st, he left Naples in charge of his cousin the Count of Montpensier and led half his army northward. At Fornovo, on the river Taro in the territory of Parma, his 10,000 troops found their passage blocked by an allied army of 40,000 men led by Gianfrancesco Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua. There, on July 5th, 1495, came the first real test of French versus Italian arms and tactics. Gonzaga, though he himself fought bravely, mismanaged his forces so that only half of them took part. The Italians were not mentally prepared to fight warriors who gave no quarter, and many of them fled. The Chevalier de Bayard, a lad of 20, offered his men an inspiring example of reckless courage, and even the king fought valiantly. The battle was indecisive. Both sides claimed victory. The French lost their baggage train but remained masters of the field, and during the night they marched unimpeded to Asti, where Louis, 3rd Duke of Orléans, awaited them with reinforcements. In October, Charles, with damaged repute but a whole skin, was back in France. The territorial results of the invasion were slight. Gonzalo, the great captain, drove the French out of Naples and Calabria, and restored the Aragonese dynasty in the person of Federico III in 1496. The indirect results of the invasion were endless. It proved the superiority of a national army to mercenary troops. The Swiss mercenaries were a temporary exception. Armed with pikes 18 feet long and formed in solid battalions that presented a discouraging hedgehog to advancing cavalry, they were destined to many victories. But soon at Marignano in 1515, the invincibility of this revived Macedonian phalanx would be ended by improved artillery. It was probably in this war that cannon were first placed on carriages that allowed them to be readily manipulated for direction and range. These carriages were drawn by horses, not, as hitherto in Italy, by oxen. And the French brought into action, says Guicciardini, such a number of field pieces and battering cannon as Italy had never seen before. The French knights, descendants of Froissart's heroes, fought magnificently at Fornovo, but the knights too would soon yield to cannon. In the Middle Ages, the arts of defense had outrun the means of attack and had discouraged war. Now attack was gaining on defense, and war became bloodier. The wars of Italy had heretofore hardly engaged the people, and had afflicted their fields rather than their lives. Now they were to see all Italy ravaged and incarnadined. The Swiss learned in this year of war how fertile were the plains of Lombardy. They would hereafter invade them repeatedly. The French learned that Italy was divided into fragments that awaited a conqueror. Charles VIII lost himself in amours, and almost ceased to think of Naples, but his cousin and heir was of sterner stuff. Louis XII would try again. 2. The attack renewed, 1496 to 1505. Maximilian, king of the Romans, that is, of the Germans, provided an interlude. He fretted at the thought that his great enemy, France, should be strengthened, and outflank him by capturing Italy. He had heard how rich and fair and weak that land was, not yet a country, but only a peninsula. He too had claims on Italy. Technically, the cities of Lombardy were still imperial fiefs, and he, head of the Holy Roman Empire, might legally give them to whomever he wished. Indeed, had not Lodovico bribed him with Florence and another Bianca to confer upon him the Duchy of Milan? Moreover, many Italians invited him. Both Lodovico and Venice were appealing to him in 1496 to enter Italy and help them resist a threatened repetition of the French assault. Maximilian came with a handful of troops. Venetian subtlety persuaded him to attack Livorno, the final outlet of Florence on the Mediterranean, and so weaken a Florence still allied with France and always competing with Venice. Maximilian's campaign failed through inadequate coordination and support, and he returned to Germany only slightly a wiser man in December of 1496. In 1498, the Duke of Orléans became Louis XII. As the grandson of Valentino Visconti, he had not forgotten the claims of his family to Milan, and as a cousin of Charles VIII, he inherited the claims of the Anjous to Naples. On the day of his coronation, he assumed, among others, the titles of Duke of Milan, King of Naples and Sicily, and Emperor of Jerusalem. To clear his path, he renewed a treaty of peace with England and concluded another with Spain. By promising her Cremona and the lands east of the Adda, he lured Venice into signing an alliance with him for the purpose of making war in common upon the Duke of Milan, Lodovico Sforza, and against everyone save the Lord Pope of Rome, for the purpose of restoring to the most Christian king the Duchy of Milan as his rightful and olden patrimony. A month later, in March 1499, he made an agreement with the Swiss cantons to supply him with soldiers in return for an annual subsidy of 20,000 florins. In May, he brought Alexander VI into the alliance by giving to Caesar Borgia, a French bride of royal blood, the Duchy of Valentinois, and a pledge of aid in reconquering the Papal States for the papacy. Lodovico felt helpless against such a coalition. He fled to Austria. In 3 weeks his duchy disappeared into the realms of Venice and France. On October 6, 1499, Louis entered Milan in triumph, welcomed by nearly all Italy, except Naples. Indeed, all Italy but Venice and Naples was now under French domination or influence. Mantua, Ferrara, and Bologna hastened to submit. Florence clung to her alliance with France as her only protection against Caesar Borgia. Ferdinand of Spain, though so closely kin to the Aragonese dynasty in Naples, entered into a secret compact at Granada on November 11, 1500, with the representatives of Louis for the joint conquest of all Italy south of the Papal States. Alexander VI, needing French aid in reconquering these states, cooperated by issuing a bull that deposed Federigo III of Naples and confirmed the partition of the kingdom between France and Spain. In July 1501, a French army under the Scot Stuart d'Aubigny, Caesar Borgia, and Lodovico's traitorous favorite Francesco di San Severino marched through Italy to Capua, took and plundered it, and advanced upon Naples. Federigo, abandoned by all, yielded the city to the French in return for a comfortable refuge and annuity in France. Meanwhile, El Gran Capitan, Gonzalo de Córdoba, won Calabria and Apulia for Ferdinand and Isabella. And Federigo Sanferrante, who surrendered Taranto after being promised his liberty by Gonzalo, was sent as a prisoner to Spain on Ferdinand's demand. When the Spanish army came into contact with the French on the borders between Apulia and the Abruzzi, disputes arose over the boundary line between the two thefts. And to Alexander's relief, Spain and France went to war over the exact division of the spoils in July 1502. "If the Lord had not put discord between France and Spain," said the Pope to the Venetian ambassador, "where should we be?" For a time, the fortunes of the new war favored the French. D'Aubigny's forces overran almost all southern Italy, and Gonzalo shut up his troops in the fortified town of Barletta. There, a medieval incident brightened a dismal war on February 13, 1503. Angered by the comment of a French officer that the Italians were an effeminate and dastardly people, the commander of an Italian regiment in the Spanish army challenged 13 Frenchmen to fight 13 Italians. It was agreed, the war was interrupted, and the hostile armies stood as spectators while the 26 combatants fought until all 13 Frenchmen had been disabled by wounds and taken prisoner. Gonzalo, with the Spanish chivalry that often rivaled Spanish cruelty, paid from his own pocket the ransoms of the prisoners and sent them back to their army. The incident restored the morale of the great captain's troops. They issued from Barletta, defeated and dispersed the besiegers, and defeated the French again at Cerignola. On May 16, 1503, Gonzalo entered Naples unresisted and was acclaimed by the populace, which can always be relied upon to applaud the victor. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1.